Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Brian Wrights, Executive Officer of the Durham Police Department. The Durham Police Department is releasing a synopsis of the internal investigation conducted by the Police Department's Professional Standards Division. This investigation is still ongoing, as there are parallel investigations being conducted by our Criminal Investigations Division and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. First of all, our thoughts and prayers continue to go out to the Huerta family during this difficult time. The department would like to acknowledge and commend the Durham community for support given to both the family of Jesus Huerta and the Durham Police Department. This synopsis today will provide answers to some questions concerning the events on November 19th. However, as this incident is still under investigation, all questions cannot be answered at this time. This briefing will proceed as follows. The synopsis to date will be presented by Professional Standards Division Commander Captain Laura Clayton. During Captain Clayton's presentation, there will be several items displayed on the screens behind us. After the report has been presented, Captain Clayton and Deputy Police Chief Anthony Marsh will answer questions as they pertain to the information presented. Any questions concerning the criminal investigation or other departmental matters cannot and will not be answered at this time. We ask that if you have a question, please wait for a microphone in order for your question to be captured for our recording of this briefing. At the conclusion of this briefing, a packet containing the synopsis to date and attachments will be provided by Candy Michael.
The following information is a synopsis of the administrative investigation of the death of Jesus Huerta up to this point. The focus of the administrative investigation is to address any violations of Durham Police Department policies and procedures. This investigation is independent of the investigation conducted by the State Bureau of Investigations. While the investigation itself is still ongoing, the information contained herein is based upon interviews of officers and any other persons directly involved in the incident, as well as evidence and facts obtained up to this point. The Durham Police Department is waiting for additional information, including the state medical examiner's final report and the toxicology report, in order to complete our final report. On Tuesday, November the 19th, 2013, Officer S. Duncan reported for duty at approximately 5:45 p.m. to begin a 12-hour night shift on uniform patrol. At the time of the incident, Officer Duncan had been with the department for 16 months and had just recently completed the final independent phase of his field training. After attending roll call briefing on this evening, Officer Duncan took control of Car 225. As is standard protocol, upon taking control of a police vehicle, Officer Duncan inspected the vehicle to ensure that all emergency equipment was present and functioning properly. This inspection also included a search of the front seat and rear seat areas to ensure that no contraband of any kind had been left in the vehicle by the previous user. Car 225 had not been used during the 12-hour shift on that day. The most recent user prior to Officer Duncan was Officer Ortiz. Officer Ortiz advised that the only transport he did during his shift was providing a ride to a pregnant citizen. Officer Ortiz advised that he searched the passenger prior to allowing her to sit in the back seat, and he searched the back seat after she got out. No contraband was noted. At approximately 2:10 a.m. on the 19th, the Durham Emergency Communication Center received a runaway juvenile call. This call was dispatched to Uniform Patrol a few minutes later. See Attachment 1, Computer-Aided Dispatch Report. The preliminary dispatch information is highlighted on page 7. The caller, Jesus Huerta's sister, advised the 911 dispatcher that her brother had attempted suicide in the past, but this information was not relayed in the CAD information sent to uniformed patrol officers via their mobile computer terminals in the police cars. The information from the runaway call dispatch included the following information. Jesus Huerta, Hispanic male, 17 years old. He does not have any medical or mental conditions and is not at risk. Patrol Officer D. Pickle arrived at the caller's home on Washington Street and spoke to Silva Fernandez about her missing son, Jesus Huerta. One of Ms. Fernandez's sons translated for his mother since she spoke little English. Several other patrol officers, including Officer S. Duncan and Officer D. Beck, patrolled the immediate area looking for the missing teenager. At approximately 2:30 a.m., Officer Duncan and Officer Beck encountered two teenagers at Washington Street and Trinity Avenue. Although both teens originally provided false names, it was later determined that the teens were Jesus Huerta and Jaime Perez. The officers advised communications that they were out with the missing juvenile and another subject at Washington Street and Trinity Avenue. Patrol Sergeant V. Pearsall and Corporal M. Brown checked in with the officers. Sergeant Pearsall ran Jesus Huerta's name through a law enforcement database and determined there was an outstanding arrest warrant for trespassing on the runaway teenager. These same databases were used to help confirm the identity of Jaime Perez. Officer Duncan took Mr. Huerta into custody for the misdemeanor warrant and handcuffed him behind his back. Officer Duncan conducted a cursory search or frisk of Mr. Huerta's pant and jacket pockets and placed him in the back of his patrol car. Officer Duncan's frisk did not reveal any contraband. Officer Duncan advised that he searched Mr. Huerta by using his hands to sweep both sides of Mr. Huerta's body, including his waist area. Sergeant Pearsall observed Officer Duncan frisk Mr. Huerta's clothing, but did not see him search further. Corporal Brown was also present when Huerta was handcuffed by Officer Duncan. Corporal Brown advised that he observed Officer Duncan pat down or frisk Mr. Huerta. Jaime Perez, who was with Mr. Huerta during this encounter, advised that the officers only patted their pockets and looked in their coats. Mr. Huerta was wearing thin white leather baseball batting type gloves on both hands. See attachment 2 photo. Officer Duncan left the gloves on Mr. Huerta. Officer Duncan also took custody of a backpack Mr. Huerta was carrying and placed it in the trunk of his patrol car. Officer Beck initiated a conversation with Mr. Jaime Perez, who provided a false name of Carlos Lopez. Officer Beck went to the patrol car in which Mr. Huerta was seated in an effort to determine Mr. Perez's true identity. She observed that Mr. Huerta had moved his cuffed hands from behind his back to having them behind his knees. Officer Beck advised Officer Duncan about Mr. Huerta's actions. Officer Beck eventually determined Mr. Perez's real identity and arrested him for resist, delay, and obstruct a law enforcement officer. Officer Beck transported her arrestee to the Durham County Jail. As Officer Beck was leaving Washington Street, she observed Officer Duncan remove Mr. Huerta from the back seat of his patrol car. Officer Duncan directed Mr. Huerta to get out of the back seat of the car and told him to put his handcuffs back behind his back. Mr. Huerta initially tried to move his hands back from their position behind his knees, but advised that he would need to do it in a sitting position in the back of the patrol car. Officer Duncan let Mr. Huerta sit back in the car, where Mr. Huerta was able to return his cuffed hands behind his back. After placing Mr. Huerta back in the patrol car, Officer Duncan drove to Durham Police Headquarters to pick up the misdemeanor trespass warrant. The trip from Washington Street and Trinity Avenue to Durham Police Headquarters is approximately a mile and typically takes around 3 minutes travel time by car. Officer Duncan advised that per police protocol, he had inspected the back of his patrol car, car 225, for contraband at the beginning of his shift, and Mr. Huerta was the first person to be placed in the back seat during his shift. Officer Duncan did not store any of his own personal items or portable police equipment in the back seat either. Car 225 was not used during the 12-hour shift prior to Officer Duncan taking control of the car. As stated previously, Officer O. Ortiz, who used the car prior to Officer Duncan, advised that he had searched the patrol car back seat for contraband and it was clear when he parked the car. Officer Ortiz further advised that his only transport during his shift was to provide a ride to the pregnant citizen. However, he did search her prior to the transport, and he searched the car after the transport, and it was found to be clear. The patrol car seat is a fixed, one-piece hard plastic seat. There's a plexiglass and a metal containment cage between the rear passenger area and the front driver passenger area. The floorboard allows very little access to space under the front seats. See Attachment 3, Photo 1, Photo 2, Photo 3, Photo 4, and Photo 5, showing the back seat area of Patrol Car 225. Car 225 is equipped with an in-car video recording system. The in-car video camera for Car 225 recorded video from the beginning of Officer Duncan's shift when he logged on at 6:05 p.m. until approximately 2:09 a.m. The camera system has an automatic shutoff feature that engages if the car is turned off for a certain amount of time to save the car battery. The camera will remain off unless the officer logs back on or activates his emergency lighting. It appears that the car was idle for more than 50 minutes, beginning at approximately 1:19 a.m. Once he restarted the car, Officer Duncan did not log back on to the camera system. Consequently, the camera was not recording during Mr. Huerta's arrest and transport. Officer Duncan advised that as he was driving to police headquarters, Mr. Huerta continued to move his cuffed hands so much that he had to tell Mr. Huerta several times to stop. Mr. Huerta responded by saying that he had a wedgie and was uncomfortable. Officer Duncan advised that he could also hear the sound of something rubbing against the hard plastic back seat area when Mr. Huerta was moving around, but he thought it was possibly the sound of the handcuffs rubbing against the seat. Officer Duncan advised that if he wasn't so close to headquarters, he would have pulled over to do a more extensive search of Mr. Huerta based on the arrestee's behavior in the back of the patrol car. Officer Duncan also advised that he planned on searching Mr. Huerta again once at police headquarters and felt that Mr. Huerta's behavior was indicative of someone trying to hide or discard drugs. Officer Duncan arrived at police headquarters with his arrestee, pulling into the main entrance from Chapel Hill Street. Soon after pulling into the entrance, Officer Duncan heard a loud noise that appeared to be a gunshot. The sound was very close and appeared to originate from inside the vehicle. Officer Duncan thought he was being shot at, so he jumped out of the vehicle while the vehicle transmission was still in drive. Duncan's patrol car continued moving forward until its front end collided with a parked van in the police parking lot. Officer Duncan also called out on the radio, "In the parking lot, shots fired." Officer J. Harris, who was also in the parking lot of police headquarters, observed Officer Duncan ducking down near the moving patrol car and then heard Duncan's radio traffic. Officer Harris went over to Officer Duncan, who told him that his prisoner was shooting at him. Both officers approached the wrecked patrol car with guns drawn and opened the rear seat door. Mr. Huerta was slumped over in the rear seat with his handcuffs behind his back. Blood was visible on the back seat, and a black semi-automatic .45 caliber pistol was lying on the right back seat floorboard. Officer Duncan called out over the police radio with the gunshot wound and requested emergency medical services. Mr. Huerta was declared deceased at the scene by EMS personnel. The State Bureau of Investigation was requested to investigate the in-custody death of Mr. Huerta. In addition, the Durham Police Department's Professional Standards Division, Forensic Staff, and Criminal Investigations Division are also involved in the investigation of the incident. Preliminary findings. Jesus Huerta had discussed committing suicide with some family members based upon information received during the 911 call. However, that information was not relayed to the patrol officers upon dispatch. Consequently, the officers believed they were dealing with a runaway teenager prior to discovery of the active warrant. A search warrant was later obtained for the information contained in Mr. Huerta's phone. A preliminary review of the data contained within his phone shows several text messages referring to guns. Review of this data is ongoing. Car 225 was inspected immediately prior to use by Officer Duncan, who found no contraband or weapons. Additionally, there is no reasonable place to conceal a handgun in the back seat area of Car 225. Mr. Huerta was the first and only person transported in Car 225 by Officer Duncan during his shift. Durham Police Forensics performed gunshot residue tests on Officer Duncan's hands and on the white batting gloves that Jesus Huerta was wearing when he was killed. The State Crime Lab processed the GSR test and reported that Officer Duncan's hands were negative for gunshot residue, and Jesus Huerta's gloves were positive for gunshot residue, indicating that Mr. Huerta fired a gun. See attachment 4, GSR report. The evidence and information collected thus far indicate that Mr. Huerta had a handgun concealed on his person. Officer Duncan did not discover the handgun during his search of Mr. Huerta. Mr. Huerta shot himself with that gun. All evidence indicates that Mr. Huerta died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms conducted a trace on the history of the handgun. The weapon is a Haskell .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. The last known location of the gun was ABC Dependable Pawn, located in Commerce, Georgia, on December 18, 1991. That pawn shop had been out of business and was identified by the ATF as not complying with the requirement to provide records of firearm transactions. No further information about the gun is available at this time. See attachment 5 photo. The Durham Police Department's Professional Standards Division is investigating possible violations of the following policies. General Order 4067, in custody death. General Order 4003, transporting and handling of prisoners. And General Order 4064, R3, mobile video cameras.